Hello, and welcome to Radio Free America. Today's video is about the hypocrisy of Mehdi Hasan. Now, I've been asked by some of my followers for a while now to make a video debunking Mehdi Hasan's interview or interrogation of Victor Gao. Now, it's a 47-minute video. I'm not going to go through the entire thing. I'm going to focus on one specific part of it, the hypocritical part. Let's take a look.
Now, if anyone is serious about accusing China of practicing mass injustice to the Uyghurs, give me the evidence.
Did Human Rights Watch say 500,000 people detained over the years in recent years?
You keep quote Human Rights Watch, and I tell you...
Do you know where they got those numbers from?
I don't know.
Can I tell you?
I don't know.
I thought you were the expert. You've been to Xinjiang. You've spoken to Uyghurs. You never heard these numbers?
I do not know where did they get the source.
So their source is the Xinjiang High People's Procuratorate, which has published its own statistics, Xinjiang official body, which says it's convicted 540,826 people prosecuted in the region since 2017. The United Nations Office for Human Rights looked at satellite footage. They say 10 to 20% of the population. Amnesty estimates 1 million people in camps. 500,000 is a conservative number.
This is what I want to focus on specifically. Mehdi Hasan's sources for this supposed genocide in Xinjiang. Here's the first from Human Rights Watch about the Xinjiang High People's Procuratorate. Now to start, I think it is absolutely absurd that Mehdi Hasan is quoting 500,000 people detained from this source, because even the source doesn't actually say that. While not all convicted prisoners faced political charges, the available figures indicate that the total number of people wrongfully imprisoned is much higher than generally reported based on earlier official figures. This sentence, first of all, contradicts itself, but it starts out by saying not all convicted prisoners faced political charges, while the number that Mehdi Hasan is referring to would be for people facing political charges. Now, I find this so interesting because the sentence goes on to say the number of people wrongfully imprisoned. Based on what metric? The numbers from the Xinjiang High People's Procuratorate do not say whether they were wrongly imprisoned or not. Where did this come from? These are just numbers. This is just pure data. There is nothing actually behind them. These are statistics released by, yes, China. But this is what Western media and Western talking heads like Mehdi Hasan like to use to demonize China. They take some bit of truth, and then they just add a crazy story behind it. A lot of people in the West think that Xinjiang is majority Uyghur or completely consisting of Uyghur people. It isn't. There are about 12 million Uyghurs living there, and there are about 12 million Han Chinese people, and there's 1 or 2 million people of other ethnicities. These numbers, released by the Xinjiang High People's Procuratorate, are for all convictions for everybody, including Han Chinese people. For Mehdi to claim that 500,000 Uyghurs have been detained based on these numbers is frankly absurd, because we have no breakdown on how many of these are Uyghur and how many of these are Han. Now, the data does show a spike in the immediate years after the Strike Hard campaign started, which was China's response to growing terrorism from radicalized Uyghur extremists. But once again, we have no actual explanations on what these numbers actually consist of. We don't know how many of these convictions were for financial crimes, corruption, things of that like, which China loves to crack down on, by the way. How many of these are Han Chinese people? When China stepped up enforcement in the area, they were absolutely also enforcing laws against Han Chinese people. Prior to 2017, China was a bit more hands-off with the Xinjiang region. They mostly left them to their own devices, which led to many issues, namely the growing extremism and terror attacks. Now I'm going to invoke Michael Parenti here with his non-falsifiable orthodox quote. If China continued to leave them to their own devices, they would be blamed by the West for not taking care of the Uyghur people. For instance, there were high rates of infant mortality because a lot of Uyghur villages had no running water, no modern medicine, etc., etc., etc. So the West would come out and say, well, China is just letting these people die. If China does step in and try to bring stability to the region, well, we see what happens. All of Western media accuses them of genocide. It's a no-win situation for China. They ultimately did the right thing. Of course, it's better to bring stability to the region than to leave it to fester and rot. So, to sum up Mehdi Hasan's first quote, he's giving a 500,000 number from Human Rights Watch, which even Human Rights Watch says cannot be accurate because they don't know what amount of that number are political prisoners. And of course, they don't know how much of that number are Uyghurs, considering they're less than half of the population of Xinjiang. Why is he quoting 500,000 here?
The United Nations Office for Human Rights looked at satellite footage. They say 10 to 20% of the population.
For Mehdi's second source, he's looking at the UN Human Rights Office's analysis of satellite data to imply that 10 to 20% of the Uyghur population are locked up. Do you understand what that number is? There are 12 million Uyghurs, as I said. 10 to 20% is 1.2 million to 2.4 million. First, let me show you the part of this report about satellite imagery, which Mehdi Hasan is referring to. Available satellite imagery from public sources similarly provide indications of many structures with security features such as high walls, watchtowers, and barbed wired external and internal fencing, which appear to have been established or expanded across the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region since 2016, concurrent with the Strike Hard campaign. Now let's look at the footnote for that. It's from 137. See Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the Xinjiang Data Project. Now, we all know that Mehdi Hasan is a reporter. He's a decent reporter, so surely he knows the difference between, for instance, a tertiary source, a secondary source, and a primary source. So I'm wondering why he would cite the UN report in this instance instead of, for instance, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Why didn't he mention them by name? They provided the satellite data, and they did the analysis that the UN is quoting here. Does Mehdi Hasan know what the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is? Surely he does, right? Has he looked into their funding sources? It's freely and openly available on their website. Surely he actually investigated the sources that he was quoting in this interview, right? He could have pulled up their funding for 2022 to 2023. Do you think he did that? ASPI is a wholly owned Commonwealth company formed in 2001 as an independent, nonpartisan think tank. It was set up by the Australian government as an independent institute with key purposes in mind. What purposes do you think those might be? What purposes do the Australian government have in spreading propaganda about China, their main enemy? I always find this so interesting. They say maintaining a diversity of funding is important. Do you think that's true? It allows ASPI to remain independent in the content of our research and in all editorial judgments, and the Institute employs a rigorous internal and external peer review process. ASPI prides itself on its transparency, and our sources of funding are identified in our annual report, which we're looking at right now. Let's take a look at how diverse this funding is. They get $4 million per year from the Department of Defense, the Australian Department of Defense. They get another $4 million from other federal government agencies, Australian federal government agencies. They get $3.4 million from overseas government agencies. Guess who that is? And the private sector gives them $1.4 million. This is the section of overseas government agencies that are funding ASPI, and there's some interesting entries in there. Notice something about them? The Embassy of Japan, China's enemy. The European Parliament, China's enemy. Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, China's enemy. UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, China's enemy. Do you see where I'm coming from here? Look at all the different projects that the US Department of State funds. My favorite one, disinformation and social media projects. The US gave them $500,000 for disinformation and social media projects. And Mehdi Hasan is unironically citing this organization to demonize China. The private sector funding gives us an interesting look as well. Let's see how diverse this is. Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft. By diversity, they don't mean like different political ideologies, like some communist funding, some capitalist funding. They mean just different levels of capitalist funding. And of course, they also get funding from defense industries. Only one in 2022 and 2023, but if you look back at their other years, you see all the usual suspects. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, who recently executed 2 whistleblowers. So why do all these enemy governments of China fund the ASPI? Why do all these capitalist mega corporations fund ASPI? Why do defense contractors fund ASPI? Well, it's because the ASPI demonizes China. The Australian and US governments can use that to manufacture consent against them and to perhaps drum up defense spending to appease the corporations that actually run those governments. I'm not going to dwell too much on this UN report. The last thing I want to say about it is that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is by far not the only extremely biased source that they cite. You can see, just in the previous citation from the one with the ASPI, they're citing the Xinjiang Papers, the China Cables, and the Xinjiang Police Files. These are all documents released by Adrian Zenz. Have you heard of him before? This UN report also directly cites Adrian Zenz twice. So who is Adrian Zenz? Well, he's the key architect behind the Uyghur genocide lie. Pretty much all sources trace directly back to him. He's also a senior fellow and a director in Chinese studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is a non-profit anti-communist organization in the United States authorized by a unanimous act of Congress in 1993 for the purpose of educating Americans about the ideology, history, and legacy of communism. Read, brainwash them. See, because after the Cold War, the U.S. wanted to refocus their propaganda efforts against their new major enemy, that being Communist China. So they started this organization through an act of Congress. Yes, U.S. Congress, the U.S. government. Back to the UN report for a second, I want to highlight one thing. They directly cite the Xinjiang Police Files. Okay? Here's the website for the Xinjiang Police Files. Do you notice something about the logo at the top there? The Xinjiang Police Files is a project of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. They created this website. They published the files themselves with Adrian Zenz. And the UN, and I guess indirectly Mehdi Hasan, cites these leaked documents from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Keep that in mind. Let me tell you a bit more about the VOC. You can see here from their wonderful main page that they make the absolutely deranged claim that communism killed over 100 million people. If you go to their research page, you can see where that number came from. They are directly quoting the Black Book of Communism. Not only that, but they're misquoting it because the Black Book of Communism does not claim that communism has killed more than 100 million people. It actually claims that it killed less, but for some reason, most Western organizations just round up by 6 million people, including the VOC. Not only did they round up, they said it's more than 100 million people. Here's a page about it from ProlWiki. Of the between 93 million and 100 million people, a huge portion of them are all Nazi collaborators killed by the Soviets. Yes, they count Nazi deaths in the death toll of communism. Among other things, they also compare the expected population growth before a famine to the actual population growth. They're counting unborn children as victims of communism. People who never existed and could obviously never have been killed are somehow in this 93 to 100 million number. Also, recently, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation tried to say that the worldwide death toll of COVID should be attributed to communism. Yes, that's including the millions of deaths in capitalist America. Those aren't deaths attributed to communism. That is the failings of capitalism. The main author of the Black Book of Communism, Stéphane Courtois, was so dedicated to trying to hit that 100 million number, he didn't even manage to, by the way, that he jumped through some insane hoops to try to get there. This led to 3 of the book's main contributors publicly disassociating themselves from his statements in the introduction and criticizing his editorial conduct. 2 of the co-authors felt that Courtois was obsessed with arriving at a total of 100 million killed, which resulted in sloppy and biased scholarship, faulted him for exaggerating death tolls in specific countries, and rejected the comparison between communism and Nazism. About this comparison, a historian wrote that unfortunately the authors of the Black Book reduced the comparison to body counting, charging communists with killing nearly 100 million people and the Nazis 25 million. At best, this approach is ahistorical and demeaning. It's a form of Holocaust revisionism. It is to claim that the Nazis weren't so bad in comparison to those evil commies. And yes, of course, the Black Book of Communism and its magical 100 million number is the foundation for the creation of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. By the way, even if the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation's 100 million number is true, capitalism surpasses that every 5 years with its death toll. 8 million people in capitalist countries dying from a lack of clean water because it's not profitable to build wells. Almost 8 million dying of hunger in capitalist countries because it's not profitable to feed them, and 3.5 million dying from curable diseases or vaccine-preventable illnesses because it isn't profitable to heal them. As this graphic states, know the real enemy. And back to Mehdi Hasan, his third citation was Amnesty International estimating 1 million people in camps.
Amnesty estimates 1 million people in camps. 500,000 is a conservative number.
Amnesty International makes this claim in many different articles and reports of theirs, the main one being this report, China, like we were enemies in a war. This is the one that is most commonly cited. It's the most comprehensive, we'll say. Again, I'm not going to go through this entire 160-page Amnesty International report, but just know that they cite Adrian Zenz 8 times in it. Here he is, Adrian Zenz. It's an article of Adrian Zenz from the Jamestown Foundation. The Jamestown Foundation is quite interesting. A former CIA director helped back the formation of the Jamestown Foundation. It was specifically created because the former director of the CIA was complaining that the U.S. intelligence community did not provide sufficient funding for Soviet bloc defectors. So it was obviously created to propagandize about communism, just like the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And in this Adrian Zenz article from the Jamestown Foundation, he cites his just over 1 million claim of Uyghurs that are or have been interned in political re-education facilities. Here's an article from China File about the origins of the 1 million figure for detentions in Xinjiang camps. In it, it states that 2 key studies independently arrived around the 1 million mark by using limited data samples to estimate what percentage of the ethnic minority Muslim population is detained. The first estimate was from Adrian Zenz. It is, of course, based on leaked documents. Of course, we don't actually know the source of these leaked documents, just as all of the documents that have been leaked about Xinjiang that Adrian Zenz has personally verified. So once again, Mehdi Hasan knows the difference between a primary and a secondary source. He knows the source isn't actually Amnesty International. I don't know why he's quoting Amnesty International here. He's citing Adrian Zenz. He's citing the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Now, you might be thinking, well, this video is titled The Hypocrisy of Mehdi Hasan, so where does that come in? Well, allow me to show you. This is a video featuring Mehdi Hasan from his news organization, Zedio.
That's what's in Project 2025. That's what could be heading our way. And if you want more people to know what's in it, then share this bloody video with them, will you?
This is a video in which Mehdi Hasan is giving details about what Project 2025 entails. He is obviously against Project 2025, as everybody should be. Now, if you thought I was going to say Project 2025 was created by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, you are mistaken. It was created by the Heritage Foundation. Just one problem with that, though. The Heritage Foundation is deeply intertwined with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Meet Lee Edwards. He's a former chairman emeritus of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He founded it. Funnily enough, in his very short early life and education section on Wikipedia, he says he was influenced by the politics of his parents, both anti-communist. Yeah, unsurprising. Edwards co-founded the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation with the Heritage Foundation's founder and chairman, Edwin Fuellner, and was appointed its chairman emeritus. So Lee Edwards, who is a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, worked with the person who started the Heritage Foundation to start the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Do you understand how they're deeply intertwined? We can even see from articles on the Heritage Foundation's website how closely intertwined they are with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Here's an article from Lee Edwards, the guy who started the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, talking about the 100 million victims of communism. He's directing people to go to victimsofcommunism.org. Here's another article from the Heritage Foundation on the museum that the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation opened. It directly mentions Lee Edwards, the chairman emeritus of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It was given the foundation's annual Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom. They give awards to each other. A third article from the Heritage Foundation on the VOC. The Holodomor, 2 to 7 million dead. The Gulag, 1.5 million dead. The Great Leap Forward, 30 million dead. It's specifically talking about the Victims of Communism Museum from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. How is it that Mehdi Hasan can release videos demonizing Project 2025, deservedly so, but then go on to cite propaganda from an organization that is deeply intertwined with the organization that created Project 2025. These organizations are the same. They have the same goal: to spread anti-communist propaganda and to move the US further and further right. What's going on with Mehdi Hasan? This guy is considered to be progressive, yet here he is citing CIA-funded sources and far-right anti-communist think tanks in order to demonize China. Why is he doing that? Why is no one calling him out for that? Yes, his coverage of Palestine and the genocide there is great, but what is he doing in relation to China? Why is he spreading U.S. State Department propaganda about America's enemy, China, while pushing back on U.S. State Department propaganda about its other enemy, Palestine? I'm honestly asking you, because I have no earthly idea why he would do this. As a little bonus for the end of the video, I'd like to just show one of Mehdi Hasan's 3 guests in this debate with Victor Gao, Rayhan Assat. Now on screen there, it calls her an international human rights lawyer. But in the description, it admits that she is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a member of the Atlantic Treaty Association. The Atlantic Treaty Association is an umbrella organization which draws together political leaders, academics, military officials, and diplomats to support NATO. It's essentially NATO light. Not only that, though, Rayhan Assat is also a senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. The Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights is a Zionist organization. Yes, Mehdi Hasan brought on someone who is a fellow at the Atlantic Council, essentially NATO light, and also someone who belongs to a Zionist organization. Pro-Palestinian Mehdi Hasan brought Rayhan Assat on to demonize China. Finally, this is an article from the Atlantic Council on experts reacting to what the International Court of Justice said in the genocide case against Israel. It has an excerpt from Rayhan Assat, and in it, she does a little bit of a whataboutism Oh, well, the ICJ is accusing Israel of genocide. Why aren't they doing the same for China? Based on what Adrian Zenz, senior fellow and China director at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, says. She compares a fake CIA genocide in Xinjiang to a very real one in Palestine, one that we can see with our eyes and hear with our ears. I have seen the insides of way too many Palestinian children's skulls. There is zero evidence that anything untoward is happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and yet disgusting mouthpieces like this will compare the two. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to this channel. Click the bell for notifications, and I'll see you on the next video.